All right, let's get underway here. My name is Aaron Givens, nutrient manager from Department of Ag. We're going to go over a little bit of the standard operating procedure, or simply put, what can expect when one of your clients has one of us come out to do an informal inspection or an audit. Just a light overview. The procedure is designed to verify compliance of best management practices to protect and improve Delaware waters from agricultural and commercial organic and inorganic nutrients, and provide technical assistance to operations who are out of compliance. It's a fancy way of saying it's just a checks and balances method to make sure that farmers aren't over applying any nutrients on their farm and they're following their plan. So how did these people fall under the need for this? They have 10 or more acres that they're applying nutrients to, or have 8 or more animal units, which is roughly 8,000 pounds. So any chicken operation in this state that's operating for any integrator is going to meet this requirement. Good on lights. I know it's a little hard to see. And so another thing they must do is they must complete the nutrient manager certification classes that the University of Delaware Extension Office offers, and they must keep up with these continuing education credits. And the simplest way for them to keep up is going to Ag Week every year. They usually can walk out with their 3 years worth every time they come in, at least once every 3 years. So the evaluation types we have, Chris talked about the GP1. That falls under the animal only. There, people could also having 8 or more animal units of cows, pigs, anything that falls under that type of plan goes there. We have land only, pretty simple. You're tilling land, you're applying nutrients, 10 or more acres, you meet that. And if you have land operations, it's a pretty simple combination of one and the and or the general permit 2 and 3 thing. General permit 2 is going to be for people who are CAFOs who are also applying land. So if their plans are combined, they would be under this. That's hopefully coming out in the next year. If a client has 2 separate plans, they have an animal one and a land plan, they would not fall under here. They would fall under distinctly separate categories. And general permit 3, it's sort of a mixed bag of everything else. If you have a plan written and they're tilling 100 acres and they have any type of animal on it, they fall under GP3. Even if they're a poultry CAFO, say they meet those requirements, and then they have the plan written in such a way that they have 2 cows written on that plan, they are now under GP3, even though they are mostly just a poultry CAFO. So how do you get selected for one of our revision things? Random selection. Most people are supposed to be audited every 5 years. So we have a system that tracks when you were last done, and then you'll just move up to the top after 5 years. You can also be targeted different ways through consultants singling out a good actor. Target by non-compliance is one of the biggest ways. The simplest thing to do is make sure your clients are turning in their annual report every year. People who continually don't turn this in continually see us because we can't verify that they're turning in their plan and they're actually, doing what they're supposed to be. Or if you're participating in a state or federal program that requires you to have a revision of what you're doing, something like a new emerging practice or something that's not in the normal effect of BMPs that we're typically writing for. How you're notified. We try to make it as easy as we can. Farms are a dynamic thing. This is not something that's normal 9 to 5 business hours. We give you a call. We try to get you within 7 to 14 days, something that fits your schedule. We're pretty flexible in how we do that, and the plan writer or you guys can be there if you want. Personally, all the general permit 1, I've not had a plan writer come out at all and be there. It's more or less just checking that you've put everything in the plan, and those are pretty cut and dry, and that the operator is making sure that they're following all the things that they're supposed to be following. But for all the land ones, a high percentage of plan writers tend to come out. The farmer feels a little bit better, it seems, in those meetings when they're there, just to make sure that they're verifying some things, or if something changed along the way and they needed an addendum but didn't get around to it yet. All right, so after we get a hold of you, we typically will mail you a letter or email if you're a little more tech savvy, trying to move that way, cut down some paper, of all the requirements and documents we're looking for when we come out. And if we can't get a hold of you to set up the audit after mailing you and trying to get a hold of a phone, we might have to go to like more drastic measures to get a hold of you or ask you to come in front of the commission. This typically doesn't happen. We're just trying to get a hold of people that are in that non-compliance range of haven't responded to anything for years, but you still seem to be a functioning farming operation by some other verification method. So when we come out, things we're looking for, your most current nutrient management plan. Your CAFO no lands are every 5 years, and they've moved to the no expiring now for at least through the districts. They're just getting a signed letter on top. But we're looking for so right now we would start looking at 2018's implementation records and plan you used. But if we came out, say, in January, we're not going to look at the new farming season. We're going to look at the previous one as well. We want to see what your most recent farming activity is and the records you have for that. So the typical things we're looking for, the dates your crops are planted, your fertilization applications of nitrogen, phosphorus, any organic applications you made, manure, DAP, things like that. That your plan has your realistic yield goals and if you're applying to that. And then any manure export records. So if you're doing a little broking on the side, you have an poultry farm and you're exporting manure from your farm, who's getting it and how much they are taking at the time. It doesn't need to be super accurate. It's how much is in your truck. So if my truck holds 10 tons and I took those 10 tons to somebody, we did it on this date, or however that's working out. And when we're evaluating stuff, we're usually looking at your previous 3 crop implementation records or 24 months, whichever one is less. More evaluation stuff. So say you're someone who has 100 fields out there, we're going to pick a couple, just go through your plan, we're going to randomly select, and then we're going to go, okay, what's your implementation stuff like this? What did you plant? How much NMP did you put down? Are you applying it to the rates that are specified for your field? And are within the range. And when we say within the range for that, there's a 25% on the high end that you can I don't want to say over apply, but crop need trumps what the plan says. An example of this is like this year when you got a lot of rain in that certain period, you might have lost your nitrogen or something like that. You have a justifiable reason for why you needed more of something at the given time to make sure that your crops could get to where they needed to be for that season. More on the evaluation we come out. It's just 2 people that are going to be there. You need your certified operator, somebody obviously on the farm, has to be through those classes, up on their credits, and obviously present for your evaluation. It's pretty simple. Again, this is more of the same. It's just your animal waste management plan or your nutrient management plan for the period we're going to be looking over. That's written by a certified person, you guys. This is something that's come up before in the past. Somebody who is under the CAFO threshold, but how do I want to say this? Somebody who is under the CAFO threshold, but has animals and is only doing animals, technically can have a farmer written plan. There's a template they're working on. But if anybody who is going to be getting a CAFO permit at all, has to have a plan written by a certified consultant who has passed the test in Delaware and has paid the $150. Minimum requirement for that. And then when we come out, we're going over your plan and we're looking at it for completeness, essentially. That's going to be impossible to read on this screen. I'm just going to talk through it for you. The records of implementation we're looking for, that you have your actual yields, and we're going to look at that versus what your planned yields are, best 4 of 7 years. The nutrient types you used, organic or inorganic, we're looking for things like your fertilizer receipts. If someone did it, what rate did they put it on? How much they do it? When did they do it? This can be receipts, invoices, any type of ticketing like that. It needs to have the NP and K content that can come from the label, the printout of what they have that they're actually giving you, some way of knowing that what the content you were putting out, so we can match it versus what you said you were going to need to apply. And then we're looking at the rates, pounds, gallons, tons applied per acre, and then total amount applied per crop cycle. Farming is again a dynamic business. Sometimes you're not always keeping things together in the most neat way. It can be at different rates. We'll take some time and we'll go through the math with you to make sure that everything meets the spec, even though it doesn't all have to be Excel spreadsheet perfect where everything comes up and we're doing it all in one unit all the way across the board. I would like it that way, but you know, we've got to be realistic on some of this stuff. Just more on the evaluation, things we're looking for: dates applied and method of application. Did we broadcast the manure? Did we inject? Things like that. Are we calibrating our equipment? You know, your manure spreader, how often are they calibrating it? Did you calibrate it this year? Did you calibrate it 3 years ago? The rate's going to be not so close if you're not doing it continually. Are you actively doing this? And this is for people who are handling manure or storing it. Again, the manure export records, that's one of the things, just one of the boxes I have to tick. Are you keeping these records at all? And going to look at your manure storage methods. This is typically for CAFOs where we come out and we, you know, look around. Are you utilizing your shed correctly? Are you keeping everything pushed back in? Do you have it outside strung along the pads? Things like that. You know, just best management practices we're looking for in your plan. Do you have your PSI, your phosphorus site index? So we know if you're allowed to put P out on this field or not. Where are you on that range? What nitrogen credits are we looking for from cover crops, from previous crops that you had, if you had soybeans or something like that? Are you doing your PS&Ts or your pre-sidedress nitrogen testing? Just things like that, BMPs we're looking for in your plan to make sure that we know what you got. Additional BMPs may be collected to capture for crediting, for things like Chesapeake Bay model, for stuff on our end. Things like animal operations like CAFOs are using mortality freezers. You have a manure shed, heavy use pads around the edge. All these things stack up in terms of accounting for us if we can capture these things. Other ones are, do you have, you know, extra grasses or trees out there? Are those in the plan? I know some people that are CAFO operators don't have them in their plan, but there are BMPs that can be put in there. And then for land operations, do you have your setbacks? Do you have your cover crops, soil testing, PS&Ts? Any BMPs that can be put in there, you know, just try to have them in there so that we can capture what Delaware is doing to show that they're doing the best they can on their end to eliminate any type of nutrient runoff in the state. This is sort of something that we saw this year, specifically with all the rain and adjustments and revisions you see in plans. I know any revisions to your nutrient management plan must be justified, documented, and included in your records. An addendum is required from your certified consultant for any significant alterations, including a 25% increase in the operation size. So basically what we're looking for here is a year like this where it rained a ton. You might not have gotten your corn out there, but you still got your starter out there for your corn. You got inundated. Now we're at soybeans, and we're going to move to the soybean rate that maybe you have the narrative-based plan in there. When you have a narrative plan, that's a little bit easier, but if you're writing linear plans where we're going to do corn, we're going to do this on this day, and we're going to move through the season, but we've now gone to soybeans. The plan writer, you all need to make sure that when they go to beans and they're fertilizing to that, they get an addendum in their plan to say that, hey, we did this, these are our justifications for it, even though we started this way and it looks like we might be a little over, that 25% generally covers most people, so they won't be over that 25%. But if they are, these are the reasons we're doing what we're doing. How we evaluate these things. So technically, all the audits are a two-part thing. We're looking at the operator and the consultant. The consultant is simply, was the plan complete and meet all of the recommendations and have all the things that the farmer needed to follow? And the operator is, are they keeping their records and they're managing their farm to what the plan says they're supposed to be managing it to? And overall compliance determined from that. So the levels you're looking at, compliant is simply you passed. You're doing everything you're doing and you're following, everything's great. Substantive compliance, application rates have a good explanation or within nutrient management recommendations. Technically, if you apply less, you're not following your plan, but if you're getting your yield goals, that's fine. It's just another way of saying you passed. This is where it comes into the people who are not so in that okay range. Your procedural non-compliance, your application rates have a good explanation or within nutrient management recommendations. So this is where we're coming back where you had weather and you had a weather issue. You changed your crop type and you moved to something else. You might not have your addendum in your plan yet, but you know what you're supposed to be doing and following, because most farmers can be adaptive, but they didn't follow it to a T and they don't have it in their plan. This comes up with your linear-based plans where you haven't gotten things in there yet. So this was where you would fall if that was some of the case. And then you have your non-compliance people. Environmental issues need to be addressed on the farm. Things like your records not being kept fails you on the audit. I can believe that you're a good farmer and that you're doing everything on your farm, but if you're not keeping your tickets together, I can't see anything of what you're doing. I cannot pass you, no matter how much I like you and I believe you're honest. It's just something I can't do. Or you're not following your plan, you're improperly handling waste. So technically you have a major non-compliance if you have a manure shed and you're outside the window of when it is okay for manure to be moved in and out of your shed, and you're stockpiling on your pads in the production area of your poultry farm. That is technically a major non-compliance issue if you're stockpiling on a production area under a non-covered surface when you have the shed right there. There's other windows where it's okay for manure to be outside, but that's moving of birds and other things like that. All right. You can kind of figure out one of the biggest reasons people don't pass is they're not keeping their records together. If someone needs a record book, I have them, I'll mail them to you, hand deliver whatever it gets you on board. It just needs to be, it can be linear, just we did this on this day, this on this day, this on this day, and then that will cover you almost all of the time. Yeah. So pretty simple, upon completion of the audit, we're going to get back to you, we're going to review it. Sometimes it'll be instantaneous. If everything's perfect, we're going to tell you everything's okay, but if some things are off, we're probably going to go back to the office. I'm going to talk with Chris about some things, what the actions we're going to take. And sometimes it's as soon as 2 weeks that we're going to come back out and look at what you're doing. Or if you're somebody who is, a land operator, we're probably going to come out the next year as well and see what you did on the next year to make sure that we got back onto the ball from where we were. The 2-week revision is sort of something like, I see a lot of the poultry stuff where you're improperly storing, farm's dirty, your pads are dirty or something like that. I'm just going to say I'm going to come out in about 2 weeks. I just want to see these things pushed back, and I'm going to check the box off that you were able to correct the things that you were doing before and move on. Again, it's pretty simple, but it's program staff discretion for how we proceed with what's happening. There's no, this gets an A, this gets a B, this gets a C, and then we tally everything up. It's discretion on what type of non-compliance we see. All right, any questions at all? About like I thought.
Well, folks, I'm Bob Coleman, and I am your friendly neighborhood manure cop, otherwise known as the poop police. Farmers have all kinds of clever names for us. If I'm speaking too loudly or not loudly enough, please let me know, because what I'm about to say is, of course, very important. There we go. Gotcha. Okay, so what I want to talk about this morning are nutrient management plan changes and amendments. One of my duties at DDA, I'm the guy who pays the cost share for the nutrient management plan that all the plan writers write. So we'd like to talk a little bit based on that about what we expect on our end as an agency if conditions such as this past crop year's crazy weather causes there to be an operational change, such as switching out crops or switching out nutrient application rates to cropland. Okay, little history here. Let's start with that. As far as nutrient management planning here in Delaware, it started in 2001. We had full implementation in 2007, and the way that worked, we had some early cooperators in 2001, some good progressive farmers. But starting in 2003, we mandated that 20% of everybody we could identify as an eligible landowner must become certified and must have a nutrient management plan written. Again, that went in 20% increments each year through 2007. And at that point, we had pretty much captured the entire universe of people that actually apply nutrients. We hope. There are new farmers too, and as those come along, we deal with those on a case-by-case basis. Now, this is very important, what I'm about to tell you. In Delaware, as opposed to Maryland or other states, plans are kept on the farm. The plan writer and the farmer do not need to send us a copy of the plan. Honestly, we don't have any place to store them, and there's a lot of confidential business information in those plans. We feel more comfortable. Farmer and plan writer hold on to their copies. We will come to see you. The exception to that, if the farm is a mixed-use operation, in other words, if it has livestock and grows crops, we do need the complete plan, because for a mixed-use operation, where the manure goes, the CAFO permit follows, and typically farms who are mixed use use their own manure on their own cropland. So that's very important. CAFO, we've talked about a little bit so far. We'll talk a little bit more as we move forward, but it's a very formal permitting process. So it's important that we as a regulatory agency and the farmers as a regulated community really do everything by the book, because there are a lot of third parties who keep tabs on all of our actions. Okay, so if you are a mixed-use CAFO, the plan must be submitted to the nutrient management program, and any updates or addendums are included in that. So if it's raining like crazy and all the nitrogen goes out of the field and the farmer has to put down additional nitrogen, the plan writer needs to write a formal addendum. It's fine. We understand that that happens. We need a copy. Obviously, the farmer needs a copy. Okay, so in Delaware, you fall under the nutrient management law if you apply nutrients to an area of 10 acres or greater. And if that's the case, farm, golf course, public park, playing fields, anything like that, you've got to have an up-to-date nutrient management plan. Nutrients can be fertilizer. They often are in urban turf. They can be manure. They often are in production agriculture. Soil samples can't be older than 3 years, and what that means is the oldest a nutrient management plan can be is 3 years. All nutrient management plans have to be written by a certified plan writer, and that's why you good folks are here today. Okay, the nutrient management law requires plans to, 1, have field maps with reference points such as irrigation pivots, roads and ditches. It also includes if there's a production area, if it's a mixed-use farm, we'd like to see where the chicken houses are. Just anything like that that is relevant. Don't be afraid to put it on the maps. And Chris is going to talk about a really slick mapping application that we've had worked up that I think will really help you folks as far as the geographic information systems part of the plans. You've got to have soil analysis. We need a manure analysis. Obviously, you as a plan writer need both in order to calculate what the correct rate should be for the farmers. We need the current and planned crop rotations. We need the expected yields, and those yields are based on the best 4 of the past 7 years. The plan should have the recommended rates, timing, methods of nutrient application. Again, we understand that things like weather and commodity prices and occasionally just general craziness can change that for a farmer. That's why there are addendums. And if it's a high P soil, it must not exceed the 3-year crop removal rate. Obviously, I think we all know phosphorus really is where the rubber meets the road environmentally here on Delmarva. We key in on nitrogen certainly, but phosphorus is absolutely at the top of the list when we come out to do an audit. We want to make sure that you are meeting the recommended P rates. Very important. Okay, plans must be kept on the farm. They should be available for inspection. I've been out with EPA when they were doing inspections. They really haven't done them recently, but back a decade or so ago, they used to come out and do inspections. And I can remember very distinctly one particular inspection. We were on a mixed-use farm, poultry houses, and a fair amount of cropland. And after walking every inch of that farm, took us all day, at the end, the EPA inspector asked the farmer to go over the nutrient management plan and their records for those fields that we had been out walking. And I've got to tell you, it really impressed the EPA lady when she would say, okay, you know, the farm we were on across the road at the crossroads, and the farmer, bam, he turned to that page, there was the map, there were the yield goals, he had his records, he was able to flip through very quickly, it was fantastic. And the upshot of that made EPA go away very quickly. And you know what? That's going to make the Delaware nutrient management manure cops go away very quickly. We're going to shake your hand and leave. And that's the end result that the farmer and you, the plan writer, want. Keep the records with the plans. That's important. We don't tell you what kind of records to have, but they should be organized. They should show when you put the manure or fertilizer down, how you did it, any weather conditions that, you know, anything in comments that you think are relevant, anything like that. Keep it where you can lay your hands on it and keep it in an organized manner. So if we start asking you questions, you can quickly find it and we can get our answer, and that'll get us out of your hair, and you can get back to doing what you need to do. Very important to know too, and you're going to hear this a couple of times today, your records are not subject to FOIA. That's Freedom of Information Act. And the reason for that, they contain confidential business information. Obviously, if you're leasing ground, that ground's very productive and you're getting great yields on it, you really wouldn't want that to become public knowledge because you might have some competitors trying to outbid you on that ground. We understand that. So records are not FOIAble. That's some good government talk. Changes to nutrient management plans. We are flexible. We do understand that there may be changes, again, due to things such as weather, like this year. So if there's an increase in 25% of the facility operations, more birds, more acres, then the plan needs to be updated. If it's less than 25%, well, we're probably, the better records you keep, the better it looks to us, but it's not really a formal requirement. Obviously, there will be changes due to weather, like this year. Probably going to need more N in a year like this. Again, it's important that the plan writer update the plan, do it in an orderly manner, just do a new page and put it in the plan accordingly. Records should reflect that too. There may be changes due to late planting. Again, it rained like crazy this spring, so farmers were often a little bit late out in the field. There may be changes in commodity prices. Farmer might make a decision to change crops based on that. That does need an update. And Addendums are as legal and formal as the actual plan itself. Consider them to be fully integral to the plan, fully inspectable, so it's important that they be organized and that they be included in a timely manner. Please get them out to your clients as quickly as you possibly can. Changes in 2018 will be inspected in 2019 because we're always running a year behind. We do try to come out and do the inspections in such a way that we understand that farmers are out there trying to make a living. We try to inspect through the year, but we understand there are certain times of year, planting, harvest, things like that, when maybe our presence on the farm might be detrimental to the farmer and might lead to some negative consequences for the farmer. We will come, but we're very flexible as far as meeting the farmer and meeting the plan writer. We know that there are certain times a year for the plan writers when you guys are very busy. So we try to accommodate your schedule. It's great for us, it's great for me. We get comp time. So we'll meet you any time that works for you. We'll meet you before operations, after dinner, but the important thing is when we get there, you want to pass the inspection. Okay, recent weather patterns. Well, I don't have to tell anybody in this room. It seems like the weather just keeps getting crazier and crazier. I'm not sure if that's due to global warming. I'm not sure that if it's due to bad luck. Who knows? You know, but the bottom line, in 2017, a lot of Delaware got between 40 and 50 inches of rain. There were some areas, particularly here in western Sussex County, that got between 50 and 60 inches. And even in a relatively humid area like the east coast of the United States, that's a lot of rain. This year, between May 15th and August 13th, we got 25 to 40 inches of rain in a lot of places. Some places got 30 to 40. I think we all know it's scheduled to rain more today, and it may rain buckets, who knows. Most people have probably run into issues when you apply fertilizer and lost it with the rain. That's where that 25% wiggle room comes in, because we understand that, well, things like that happen. And we figure environmentally 25% is a reasonable threshold to give you some flexibility. Okay, let's talk about the two kinds of narrative nutrient management plans. Narrative plans can be very complex. They take into account different scenarios. The plan writer actually lays out that if A happens, the farmer will do B, but if C happens, the farmer will do D. So the farmer has a lot of flexibility. If conditions get crazy, it's already written into the plans, so there's not as much need for an addendum. It lays out the various scenarios for nutrient handling, based, as I said, based on weather, based on commodity prices, based on just all kinds of stuff. They're flexible plans, they're not easy to write. They're particularly difficult to write if the plan writer and the farmer feel more comfortable writing a one-year plan, but that can be done. And they certainly can make updating the plan easier, but they are very thick, and the farmer needs to know how to read them to make their choices based on the field conditions and the scenarios laid out therein. Okay, linear nutrient management plan. This is your more typical nutrient management plan, and they're typically written for a one-year cycle. Basically, this is where the plan writer and the farmer are pretty darn confident they're going to have a set crop rotation no matter what. So they don't really feel that there's a need to go out and have multiple scenarios. But again, if conditions change, you got to write an addendum to reflect that. The farmer needs to make sure that their nutrient application reflects that addendum and that they keep everything organized within the plan. Ditto, the records need to reflect the change in the nutrient management plan too. Folks, we have an excellent record book. You don't have to use it, but as Aaron said, we will hand deliver it to the plan writer. We will hand deliver it to the farmer. You tell us you need it, we will get you a copy. If you want to use a notebook, that's fine. We don't have an objection to that. But we can read our record book very easily, and I think the farmers can too. Just bear that in mind. Don't hesitate to contact us. If you or any of your clients would like a copy, we will get them to the appropriate person. Okay, so we're the government, so we trust, and Delaware farmers are good people, but we also verify. That's really our job. That's why you folks as taxpayers pay me the big bucks. Okay, I'm out there to check things. I know you're good people, but just for my peace of mind and for the folks in the General Assembly who put the law together, they want us to go out and check and make sure that everybody's following the conditions of the law, following the conditions in their plan. All nutrient management plans are subject to audit. I mean, that's a gentle way of saying we will be out periodically to inspect. We do routine inspections. We just pick people's name out of a hat. We try to hit everybody in a cycle. If we get a complaint about the farm, we're probably going to do an audit, because that allows us to quickly, and I'm the complaint guy too. They all cross my desk. Even things like there are bees outside my house. That crosses my desk, okay? So if there's a complaint or if it's just routine, we are going to come see the farmer. You can just expect that. We'll sit down. We'll go over the plan page by page, field by field. It can take an hour or sometimes more. We'll compare the recommendations, including the updates. Again, this is why it's very important for the farmer to keep those recommendations right there in an organized manner. And we'll compare those with the implementation records to make sure, basically, we just want to see that everything matches. If we see that there's been an addendum, we'll look for the records to reflect that too. All changes still must reflect requirements of the nutrient management law. And the nutrient management law, luckily, is not really complex. If anybody here would like a copy, please call us. We have a little booklet, but it's written in government double talk. You know, in the government, we don't really speak English. We speak government speak, which is sort of a very obscure dialect of English. But if you want the law to see what it says, give us a call and we will get you a copy. Okay, so compliance. First and foremost, it's important that the farmer keep all fertilization records. You can use our book, you can save the receipts, anything like that, but no matter what it is, save it. It will save you when we come out to do the audits. Purchase receipts are fine, that's no problem at all. If you have a commercial applicator, a lot of farmers do that, save those receipts. Basically, we want to see the date, make sure that the dates match, the amount, and the rate. I mean, it's all common sense. It's not rocket science. I'm not smart enough for rocket science. It's got to be simple so I can understand it. All nutrient management audits allow for an additional 25% nutrient application above your CNMP nutrient recommendations. But once it's 26%, everything, we're going to be checking.
Excuse me.
Yeah.
What about nitrogen soil tests and tissue samples that show that this fertilizer line is no longer there?
That always gets you a lot of grace. We do not in the law require that, but obviously that is something when we begin to question the plan writer, because let's face it, folks, very often the farmer will call the plan writer and say, holy, you know what? The guy from the Department of Ag is coming out. can you be here to help me explain all this? And that's fine. We always welcome the plan writers. In fact, I think it's a positive thing. It's a service that most plan writers offer their clients just by way of good professional practice. So if we see things like tissue analysis, if we see things like a phosphorus site index, anything like that, things that aren't legally required, they're above and beyond, boy, that just helps explain everything. It really makes my job as an inspector so much easier, and it's very much appreciated. And there was a time when we work for a commission. We're a little different than the rest of the Department of Ag. So everything that we do has to go through 19 commissioners. And there was a time we had actually proposed paying for all that. Unfortunately, for the folks in the ag community, it was the same time the state was broke. So they weren't flush with money. So the answer to that was no. So, but yeah, that's an excellent question. Any supplemental information you have, tissue analysis, etc., that's good. That's all good. Changes in capacity. Well, let me go back here. Nutrient management plan for a farm with a CAFO permit. Again, the CAFO thing, because it's an NPDES point source, that's more government talk. What that means, it's a formal permit that DDA runs in conjunction with the dreaded DENREC. They're actually very nice people. But we run that permit. Careful is not a word I use in my vocabulary. Anyone that knows me, I'm pretty reckless, I think. But this is a real formal permit. And it's based on, actually, on a portion of the federal Clean Water Act called the CAFO rule. So that just makes everything that much more formal. And if anything, it makes our scrutiny that much more precise, because it is such a formal thing, and because both the Department of Ag and DENREC have EPA looking over our shoulder all the time, that's something where really there's just no wiggle room at all. So any changes in capacity should be reflected in the updated plan. This includes changes to fields where manure is used, and the reason for that, in that particular permit, folks, not only does it permit the chicken houses and the manure shed and, you know, the drives around the production area, when the manure is taken out and applied to the farm fields, the permit follows the manure. So it's something that you really need to make sure that in the plan and in the records that is documented. And what I'm about to say too is very important, so that I don't get in trouble. That's always the most important thing to me. But really, so that the farmers and the plan writers don't have a hostile third party breathing down their neck. If one of your clients has a CAFO permit and you need to change the plan, please send those changes to us so we can put that in our file, so that if EPA comes in and does an audit of our file, which they have done twice so far, so that all that's reflected, and that way everybody is safe. Please remember that. The last thing, having given you all this technical information, I want to give everybody here some simple good news. As of last year, if a client comes to a plan writer and needs a CAFO no-land plan, just, you know, generally in Delaware, that's a poultry plan, we can reimburse the farmer $500, and of course our expectation is they will pay the plan writer up to $500 for that. So if you're interested in adding that business or that, you know, that type of plan to your business, you can do so. If you have any questions about what kind of paperwork needs to be submitted to get the payment, or your clients have questions about that, call me. You can get me at 698-4556, that is direct to my desk. And I'll get them the application and the claim forms, and if you want to do that, we'll pay for it. It's a good thing because it allows anybody with the CAFO permit to quickly get a plan written. I think we all know our good friends at NRCS and the districts, they are swamped. So this gives farmers an option to get this done. If they think, you know, there's some time constraints, they can go to a private plan writer, get it done, and they're covered and they're safe. And that's what it's all about. My phone number again, 698-4556. If you ever have any questions, please call me. Thanks for your attention, folks. I'm very appreciative.
What we've been working on for the last few months is a mapping tool. And so basically this website, which currently only the department has access to, for the first time combines about 7 different resources in terms of data layers for mapping. This tool is under initial development. So basically what happened was we went out, started following our new standard operating procedures for audits. And what we found were most of the maps in those plans were missing some of the elements that Bob and Aaron talked to you this morning about. More often than not, wellheads were not identified. Certainly agricultural wells the farmer should be aware of and be able to identify on the map. But what's really important for nutrient management is those that aren't on the farm at all. And we realize that that's a limiting data source for plan writers to be able to acquire that information and then put it on the plans. And we don't particularly care about how you generate the aerial images, but or how you get the information drawn onto them. We just really care about all the elements being there. And for whatever reason, things were frequently missing. What really got my attention was some aerial maps didn't even have the soil information. And I'm not really confident that a plan is going to be 100% useful to a farmer if they're not aware of what soil conditions are on that farm. So we realized that part of the reason that was probably occurring is because you go to the U.S. Department of Agriculture to get soil information. You might try to access a DNREC data source to get wellhead information. And at the end of the day, you still have to draw field boundaries on the map. And so that's a big challenge in terms of finding time and finding those data resources in order to draw a map that's in compliance with our regulations. The other reason we wanted to build a tool was because we realized that there are a lot of best management practices on a farm that we don't necessarily capture in an annual report. So when we mail to your clients the one-page document that asks them what their activities were for nutrient applications in the last year, we're not asking things like, did you use a PSNT? Have you soil tested more often than once every 3 years? Do you have a manure storage structure on the farm? And so those are additional things that are required for the maps, but we don't necessarily have great capture for our data keeping. And so we thought adding this tool would give us an opportunity to physically track in space where BMPs are being put on the landscape, and might make it easier for us to do these audits and determine where to look for particular practices that are important for nutrient management purposes. We also noticed that frequently private drainage ditches were also missing. These are elements that are required to be drawn on the map again, but we also noticed that most places for which the consultants are going to find aerial photos with overlaid spatial information, they might have natural streams but they wouldn't have tax ditches. That's another DNREC data source that we're able to pull from and put all together in this one platform. Now, having said all that, we've spent $0 on what I'm about to show you. And so, if you're wondering how that's possible, the answer is it doesn't work right. I'm putting this in front of you in cooperation with our information technology department so that I can actually get some feedback on how to make it better. I made a little quip before you guys went to eat that when you look at the key at the bottom of the maps that this thing prints out, it's not even labeling half of what you see on the screen right now. The blue dots with the black center position, those are wellheads. That's not identified in the key whatsoever. So that's something that's obviously important, because when the farmer goes to read that map, they need to understand what those symbols represent. What I really want to do today is give you a test drive and get some information back from you about what tools you might be using and how this might be better, or how it might be missing features that would prevent you from using it. We are not writing plans on a day-to-day basis, so we can't always guess what's useful to you. We did try though. So for example, I have a login for this application, and I can go in and I can draw these maps, but I can also see the boundaries that anyone else has drawn. So what might happen if I were to provide access to some of our plan writers in the state is you might start drawing over each other. Or there might be a client that switches from one consultant to another. And now that you're working with that farmer, you might realize that their boundaries were drawn wrong. Or you might be a consultant that doesn't really appreciate that other consultants can see what you've drawn on the map. And so we've also considered the possibility of having the self-identified information that's entered here be unique to a user, but that's going to increase the cost. So that's the kind of thing that I want to find out if that's useful to you all. So if you can see in the back, I hope you can. If you can't, feel free to get up and move to the front. What we're looking at is a few things. I will mention that what's in bright yellow in the center of the screen is a field boundary that's been hand drawn using this application. And I'm going to try to hand draw one in front of you, and I can tell you right now, using this trackpad, it's not going to go well. But we have a menu that floats in and out here, and so I can go to this field of it looks like some kind of grass cover, and I can scroll down and choose a highlighted field boundary or a non-highlighted field boundary and start clicking the edges. And as I go around this field, it's going to start drawing the shape of that field. I should have chosen an easier field to draw. That's okay. What I do like about this tool is it's reminding me every time when I get to the last position to double click, because that's easy to forget. And it's probably going to spin away for a second while it draws that. As long as I did it right. Field boundaries are one of 5 things that we've built in to have the consultants be able to label. These are the things that we don't think we already captured. Oh, thanks. We've also included private drainage ditch, and that purple color is similar to the magenta color that the DNREC tax ditch file uses. So we're trying to use a scheme of color coding, but we also know that DNREC's maps of ditching may not be the most up-to-date or accurate, especially because all these things are drawn on a particular projection of the aerial maps, so they may not line up perfectly. I think any of us that had GPS units in the early 2000s know that not everything always lines up with where you are, and certainly things have gotten better, but in mapping tools, that's fine, I'll wait. But in mapping tools, it's not always one-to-one. We've also included driveways. That's not something that's going to be in the del dot layer if you have a private drive. So we have those available for consultants to be able to draw lines, and these are pretty simple lines. You just click the points for which you want the driveway to be labeled. And then, even though it didn't show it for the field boundary I tried to draw, it does have some text that you're able to enter. In this case, there's only two options. There's pervious and impervious. We want to know specifically when we come onto a farm whether those lanes are hard paved or if they might be gravel, because we need to observe more carefully where fertilizer and manure is being applied. If that's an impervious surface, that's going to fail your audit every time if we drive up and you got a paved drive and there's a bucket of litter sitting out. You're going to have a bad audit that day. But we want to be able to know when we drive out to the farm and start driving around the farm, if we need to do spot checks of certain things, whether that's going to be a pervious or impervious surface. So that's something that we had built in. And then just to round it out, I've got BMPs here. Right now, those are just points, because frankly, what we really wanted to do was just offer an opportunity for the consultants to include the information for the BMPs that they identify. So we have a drop-down menu of typical BMP types that we look for when we're going on a site visit. That's a manure shed, a compost, or a heavy use area pad. And then you can self-enter any map label that you'd like. If you'd like to identify the track number for which that BMP is installed, say it's a PSNT, and it applied to this track number or FSA ID, you can enter that information here. And as soon as you close it, it saves it. So we've entered BMP information for that particular point. And then finally, I mentioned a little bit about wells and the challenges those have. This is again DENREC data. So these wells that are identified using this particular legend, they can be many, many forms of wells, as you can see by all the symbols here. But these are only wells that have been identified for the period of which DENREC's building these maps. So if for some reason a farmer is aware of a well that wasn't identified, we've added in our tools over here a method for them to be able to select what type of well to add and what significance that well has. There's potable and non-potable wells, and those that are on the farm have different setback requirements for manure application than those potable wells that are not on the farm. So we've got different labeling schemes for those. That covers all the things that consultants can physically add. Are there any of you aware of any features that you've been adding to maps that we might want to consider putting on top of what's been identified here? Based on some of your reactions, I think we probably captured more things than you're usually putting on, and that's okay.
You're just using the maps themselves, the overlay for the wooded areas and tree lines, that kind of thing first?
So, question about the aerial images. There's no regulatory requirement to have tree lines or anything identified, but we do require that an aerial image be overlaid with the field boundaries, and that's just in an effort to make sure that there's been enough diligence in getting those field boundaries accurate. If it crosses over a wooded tract, you can better believe I'm going to ask how old the image is and whether those trees are still there and whether they're accounted for in the plan or not.
And you can do a boundary within a boundary. You can highlight an impassable area or something like that, or a non-plantable area. Like we typically have 3 or 4 fields that have sanitary in them.
Great question. Thanks for asking it. So in terms of boundaries within boundaries, all I can do is try to do it in front of you. So, like I said, this is totally under development, but I can see over here that there's a house plot that's included in this boundary area.
Yeah.
And so I should be able to click around the same portion and be able to exclude that house, as long as the mouse picks up my clicks. I should mention, since I, for some reason, selected the original field boundary, you can add details to the field boundaries here, similar to the BMPs, and this is just standard text you can enter, and there's also the ability to view it in an attribute table if you want to download the information in an Excel form, so that you might be able to summarize different field attributes for an entire farming operation. There really is the ability to select out an area, but I'm not sure what's causing it to not register. I guess it's worth what I paid for it for now. Thanks for the question.
What about slope?
So we didn't talk about the soil field boundaries, but we are capturing that information.
You get into mapping units, right?
So I just want to show everybody the operational layers, and then I'll get to your specific question. The well information is from specifically the consultant entered, BMP the same way, driveways, private drainage ditches, and field boundaries. That's all consultant entered data at the top of your layers, and they're all independent layers. So that's how I know, even though I can't demonstrate it for you today, that they can go over each other. We have Delaware's major rivers and streams. That's in an effort to identify blue line streams on the maps. And then specifically about the soils, we're capturing that NRCS soil information, and that's by county. And so you have to turn those on and off depending on where the farm is. It is a huge data set. It does include slopes. It includes all the soil series information as metadata when you go to select those units. Now I handed you guys the maps, and you can see better on a color version, but those soil areas are identified and you can select them. When you click on them right now, there is a load time issue where you think you've done something wrong, but really it's just trying to bring all that information in. And anybody that's played with the soil maps at the national scale, you've endured that process of load time. So I suppose it's probably better now than when I was in grad school, but it's a challenge. We have the tax stitch information, and this came with a huge caveat from DENREC that it's not complete, but that they've done as good a job as they plan to do for the foreseeable future in capturing that. There's also a roads layer, and this is built by DelDOT, and I have no idea what any of this scale stuff means. We've asked them to simplify it because as DelDOT adds projects, they add different subsets of layers on there, and that's not useful to any of us, in my opinion. So they have been working with us pretty carefully trying to make that useful. I'll skip ahead to the water well permits. You can see we covered just how many of those well types there are, and luckily DENREC's done a nice job of categorizing these with symbology that is kind of coding to what the purpose of that well is. And then the tax parcel information is really helpful for us so that we can identify any change in land ownership. And I know that sometimes those tax parcels are helpful in identifying field boundaries. If there's 2 adjacent fields owned and operated by separate farmers, in an aerial map, it may not be obvious where that field boundary is. So having that tax parcel information included, we understood was helpful, and that's you can see that rendered here with the home cut out from the rest of that agricultural parcel. I'll be honest, I'm a big nerd. And I thought what was really cool about this project is for the first time we're able to offer center pivot irrigation information. So if you've been staring at this screen for the last 10 minutes of my talk, you might be figuring out slowly what these green circles are. And so what we got from USGS is a layer of center pivot irrigation that was hand drawn by USGS staff, and they've agreed to update this on the order of every 5 years. This is an issue that we run across more every year with over 150,000 acres in Delaware being irrigated. We have about a 20% hit rate for audits that we perform for which the irrigation is identified in the aerial maps, and that's about it. So 4 and 5 plans are wrong and don't have this information. I also don't expect farmers to remember to give their consultant this information. So we thought that getting this would be a great visual cue to you consultants to be able to remember to ask if you've added any irrigation. But it is not the most current thing, just like everything else in this tool. We're slaves to how quickly people put this information together. And all this does is render what we've got. So that covers all the layers. And it covers what the tool can do so far. I had a couple questions for you guys if you're done eating. It looks like you are. We realize that there are a lot of challenges with preparing maps, and I was wondering if there's anything that you guys run into that this application does solve or you hope could solve.
I think you should do one for Maryland too. We're still clicking around on Google Earth and I hate it and I want this very, very much. So good for y'all.
There's a lot of vendor farm management software that lets you do a lot of this stuff. There's Echelon, there's CPS, there's other farm management software things like LandDB that lets you do a fair number of these things. It doesn't always network well with some of the other information, but a lot of them do. I guess just one of the questions I did have for you though was if you could run down that list one more time of the things of just 1 through 6 or 1 through 8 of the things that you want to see on a map.
Yeah, perfect.
Just to make sure I didn't miss any during the.
I'm going to punt the question.
Okay.
What we're going to email to everybody that attended today in our session last week is a list of our checklist for an audit. The very middle of that checklist is the 7 things we're looking for on our aerial maps. So you guys will have it electronically and permanently in your email to be able to reference. That's easier than me reciting it and you guys trying to scribble it down.
But I guess as you work with this, if you do have access to maybe look at things like map shots or LandDB or Echelon and kind of see the kind of options that they make available in those to help figure out what's more useful for this and maybe what's not, what's just kind of fluff that the other software offers.
Thanks. I've got those 3 names. I did want to mention that we've seen plenty of plans where there's no one-stop shop, but the plan writer did the best they could. So we might have 3 pages for one particular tract, and each of those 3 pages capture a little bit something different on that tract to get to all 7 points. That's absolutely fine. So if any of you have another software that you're using that captures 3 or 4 of the things, and you want to get onto this website and capture the other 3 or 4, that's perfectly fine. While you may not be saving any trees, you're at least keeping your clients out of trouble. And we did anticipate that. We don't want to force anybody into any solution. I know that there are a lot of yield maps that make their way into nutrient management plans. I think those are great. Well, I also don't want to collect that information and keep it in a publicly accessible form. So guess what? You're going to have to do that separate, and that's for the protection of your client's private data. But hopefully, if you're worried about the eventuality of having an audit on your client's farm and forgetting the pivots, clearly there's going to be a time where there's a grace period. We're trying to work with people to get things right, and we realize that it's our duty to also provide that information the best we can. That's why we're putting this together. Are there any features on here you guys found especially useful besides the irrigation? Did anybody have an alternative method to digging up the well information? Or were you accessing state records? Or no records at all? This is a safe space, I should mention. If you want to admit something here, we're here to help. That's the whole point. You get credits, and I make sure that you pass the next audit. I think we had that question last time, and we actually gave that to the developer to include, and I haven't been able to make them show up. So to give him the benefit of the doubt, I hope they're in here because we asked for them, but chances are it's not a beautiful tool yet. It doesn't work perfectly. I haven't been able to draw it up. We do realize that, that those have changed over time. Delaware is a really flat state, so to be able to keep those boundaries the same for all eternity was never really the intent. So we want to put the most accurate and up-to-date information for watershed boundaries in there. Those are required on the annual report, so that is important.
Are you talking down to the hot level, Avery, or just?
Major,
Okay. I think,
We have that.
yeah, we have that.
I think the nutrient management program was working on
Yeah.
older
Yeah, we did it
costs
for ourselves.
for years.
Yeah, our program's using an out-of-date map right now, just because it hasn't changed since the first year we required watersheds be reported. And it absolutely drives the GIS guys nuts. They call our watershed code the HUC 11, which doesn't exist if you know that system. It's somewhere between a HUC 10 and 12. That's what our old maps were based on. So we're trying to bring it up to date. And obviously, if you include the most recent watershed information, that's the best. But we have to respect those that haven't come around yet.
because Denver has the HUD 12. So, I mean, it's
And,
available.
and if anybody has an urgent need to know watershed codes, we've already actually developed a website where you can just type an address in, and it'll geolocate it with that information. And if you want to be able to access that, just take one of my cards on the table, and I'm happy to email you the link. Okay, the only other thing I wanted to mention again was about the data sharing. This is the difference between producing a $15,000 project, which is about what we have here with a few changes, and a $35,000 project with user registration costs. And I'm not saying fees. I'm not looking to pin any of that on the consultants to be able to use this. This is supposed to be a service that we provide to help you. But if you were to keep your data separate from other consultants' data so that they couldn't see it, that's something that I want to hear back. If you want to use it as public access for where the field boundaries are, we can keep this real cheap.
So Chris, maybe clarify what information would be shared
Sure.
and what wouldn't.
So all of the layer list here is from the Delaware major rivers down to the tax parcels. That's all public information. So that's gonna render itself, and you turn it on and off whether you want to include it or not. Please include it. There's a reason that it's there. Field boundaries all the way up to water wells that are self-added. These are items that are associated with a user of the tool. we can associate with them, we can associate the data with a user account, which would require you to log in and keep a password and keep it safe from anybody you don't want editing your data. And that's something that I should add. If it's up here and there's no protection, then anybody else can go in there and start dragging lines around by accident. I see heads shaking. So we probably want to have unique users. That's something we anticipated. And so the follow-up question we had at the last meeting, and I have for you guys today, is if those clients decide to change consultants, say you gained a customer from someone else, is it going to be useful for you to use this tool if you have to redraw everything that the previous consultant drew? Basically start from scratch with that customer, even though you know that their previous plan had the maps done already. I personally, as project manager for this, thought if it's a new client, it's a new client. It's no different than if you didn't have this tool to go back and redraw everything. But the only way to share one consultant's information with another consultant's information is to share all of it, which we don't want to do unless there's some changeover in ownership of a company, somebody passing along some clients en masse.
I would say that your point of if all the information was shared and somebody else could go in and start moving lines around, I feel like that is more troubling potentially than having to start over with a new client, right? So
Agreed.
the benefits of having the individual logins outweigh the cost of picking up a new client, because like you said, without the tool, if you guys got a new client, you'd have to do all that from scratch anyway.
Is there a way to export the changes on this essentially as a shapefile, and then the operator or the farm, the person who has the farm would have their own, could download and save their own shapefiles of their fields, and then if they switch consultants, they can just go ahead and email the shapefiles to the new consultant. And then if this could upload the shapefiles, then the drawings would already be there.
Right, good question. This tool does not allow you to download shapefiles.
Okay.
That's the difference between not a $15,000 and $30,000 project. That's the difference between $30,000 and $150,000, from what I've been told, to have that capability. There is no capability here of counting acres. It does not measure the size of the boundaries that you're drawing. We did that on purpose, believe it or not. We heard from consultants and other clients that that's only going to counteract or contradict, rather, what they're getting in terms of information for crop insurance with FSA. Basically, that tract ID already has a number of acres associated with it, and so if we had a conflicting tool with its own calculated information, that's just going to create problems for people. And we said, great, let's not pay for it.
Well, if you had it, if it was each individual consultant on this, Chris, would they be able to save this file then?
Well, this is a live system. That's how it works. So when you're working in it, it's saving, much like Google Drive. If you're working on a document, as you're working, it's saving it, and you have to go in and physically delete things you want to remove. And it is unique for every user. So I can see what other guys have done, but that's just because we're in the building phase. When that's all complete, that will be yanked out, and you're looking at your own information and space for you and your clients. Yep, that's right.
Is your question about like saving to print the maps though?
Yeah, that's part of it, or to save it on your, your own computer or the network or whatever. It's for future use then.
So I'll make one more point, and then I'll just finish with a plug. This is only useful if you can print the maps out. So we do have a printing capability. The way that the print works is it's going to print out what's highlighted on the screen. So you have to drag to where the field or fields are, center them on the screen, select the print application, and it's going to generate a PDF or an image file, whatever you're comfortable with. and it's going to generate that map that I gave to you. Like I mentioned, the legend is utterly worthless right now. We're going to work on that in the interim, but what you have in front of you is the way that map is generated to go into the nutrient management plan. So if there's anything missing on here besides a complete legend that you guys would like to see, please come see me, either today after the talk or into the future. And if anybody amongst you would like to help work on this project and make it more useful, I'm also interested in putting a few consultants together in order to keep developing this, because I've gotten positive feedback at both meetings now, and we'd like to continue with the project.
It seems if you have public layers, public domain layers, and then you can export them, and then you could do your own thing for your client. No one sees that. That'd be good.
Certainly, you can create images from this tool without drawing anything of your own on there. All these layers that exist from the public domain, you can just make into a picture and open it in any picture editing software you use and draw your own lines on it, put your own data in there. You can feel free to do that.
You can't export it.
You can export picture files. That's right. It is not a robust tool. This is a web application.
Okay.
Yeah, this is not in any way, shape, or form what I would consider software. It's a live system. Good questions, guys. Thanks for the interaction.
Bill Rohr out of Harrington, Agri-Labs and Agronomy Lab, and wanted to go over some, I was asked to go over some of the variabilities that we see in pulling a soil sample and looking at some of that data. So that's my intention. I have some information about the variability that we see in soil sampling, and also, wanted to, I have some data from kind of the Midwest, but it's very interesting, really evaluating the soil test K to the plant tissue K to soil test K base saturation and yields. So it's neat because it's all connected, and it makes sense. It's one of those things, in my opinion, that I would like to see land-grant universities do more of. We often, as agronomists, we are in a process of elimination in why we're having a problem or why we're not getting a higher yield. So to be able to connect some data that's reproducible and producing higher yields is a path in the right direction. I did also want to recognize Kathy. She's here from Agri-Lab. She's a certified consultant. So I'd like to make this as open of a discussion as we can. Can you all see that okay? So if there's, is that better? All right. So please, you guys are agronomists also, so let's make this an open discussion. But when it comes to really pulling a representative sample, in my opinion, it's one of the most important jobs as an agronomist, primarily because that's where your significant variability comes from, is actually pulling that sample. It's easier from a university perspective. We can go to a 100 by 100 grid, and we can do all kinds of sampling, and we can really pay close attention to that. And you're not going to see the kind of variability that you're going to see with a 10, 20, 30, 50 acre soil sample. And that's reality. That's typically how it occurs. So before we get into that, I do wanted to give a few plugs just about the business. We're an agronomy lab. We're in the business of, we're in the data business. We provide data to support better decisions and to solve problems. Soil, plant, manure, slurry, fertilizer, water, and feed. We have NIR for some feed, and we do also some microbiology work for food safety. We do some work on compost. We're certified under U.S. Composting Council to run compost samples through their program. So pretty much anything you need agronomically, we can do it. Our primary extraction method is a Mehlich 3. So we are extracting the, in theory, plant available nutrients in that soil. Is it exact? No, but it's really the best out there to make decisions on what's in soil solution or what's going to be in soil solution when the roots are actively growing and what's going to be available to go up into that plant. There's a lot of variables even when it comes to Mehlich-3, the soil temperature, pH, those things have a lot of influence on when that nutrient is going to be available for plant uptake. Automation, over the years, we've been able to really invest a lot of money into automation to be able to handle the volume that comes in typically in the fall. I mean, we're running soils, every day, pretty much every day throughout the year, but to be able to handle that higher volume in the fall and also to deal with some of our challenges in the lab with human error, automation is basically everywhere within the lab. Again, I said we're in the data business, so quality control is important. We put a lot of effort and spend a lot of money into proficiency programs. There aren't a whole lot of certifications out there for soil testing labs, but there's all kinds of proficiency programs. So we can compare our data to the other 60 labs across America, and you know that the labs are extracting and measuring a Mehlich-3 within a pretty small window. All right, so let's go a little bit into the variability. There's one obvious variability that you see when you're pulling soil samples, and that's a natural variability, and that's a soil type. I don't know how well you can see it here, but I mean, you have some darker soils and some sandier soils, and all those soils react much differently to releasing plant nutrients and changing in pH, and it just creates a challenge often in making good decisions. So, often you ask yourself, should we be pulling a 5-acre sample or a 10-acre sample or a 20-acre sample? A lot of that has to do with the existing variability that you have. If you're starting from scratch, you want to pull as many samples as possible. Do I support grid sampling? I do. I think it really gets a lot of the variability out. I don't think it's all that necessary every year, but it uncovers a lot of the variability that you see in mapping your soil data. Beyond some of your natural influences and variabilities, you have man-made variabilities. You have mechanical things. This is an interesting picture that was on our mapping program, Chris, and the picture was taken right after it's obvious to me that lime was applied, and it was before they got finished incorporating all the limestone. So you can see a tractor went across here with the disc. But my point is, this is the only snapshot that you can see the kind of mechanical variability that's being introduced into this farm. I mean, look at the lime applications here. Look at the turn rows. Look at these areas where it's a little bit lighter. Is that going to change chemistry across that field? You bet it is. So how do you figure that out? You really only figure it out when you go over it with the combine, or you stick the probe in the ground and you have that pH is a little different than the rest of the field. So, you have irrigation, you have dry corners that, change a lot less aggressively than your irrigated areas. I mean, your pH will drop a lot faster in your irrigated area versus your dry corners. Your nutrients drop a lot slower, in your dry corners versus your irrigated because of the uptake and the crop removal. So, these are the kind of, management units that you need to pay attention to when you're pulling a soil sample. If you're mixing the dry corners with the irrigation, that's the wrong answer. You're going to distort your average number, and you're just not really treating that soil fairly to get the optimum output and to minimize your inputs. So one of the things that I did, it was about 2 years ago, was to really evaluate the where else do we see variability when it comes to pulling a soil sample. So your traditional way is going out to a field and doing a W formation and sticking the probe in the ground in about 5 or 10 different places, mixing it up, putting it in a bag and sending it to the lab. You can be as aggressive as you did here for my farm, where you go out with 1-acre grids to really visually look at the variability in some of the different areas on the farm. So what we did basically was we looked at traditional W formation and went out and pulled some samples on this particular field. This is the same area inside of the tract there. So it's about a 10-acre field. have 10 different locations. We kind of divided the 10 acres into 5 acres west and 5 acres east. And there are 5 different places in that field where we stopped. I stopped and got off the four-wheeler and went around and pulled a soil sample. So for each one of these locations, we're able to evaluate the variability of soil depth and also the variability of just being in a different portion, a different sampling spot within that field. So what I physically did was I just stopped the four-wheeler, went around, stuck the probe in the ground in 4 different places. And when I dumped the soil out, I had top 5 inches, middle 5 inches, and bottom 5 inches. So we're looking at the top 5 inches of that soil, the middle, and the bottom. So we have a total of 15 inches, but the data is segregated in 5-inch increments. So I did that in 5 places here on west and then 5 places on east. You follow me? Before we chart this data, basically you need to follow that a little bit. All right, so basically let's just look at that data in that field. The first thing that we saw with pH, and I know it's a lot of different bar charts here, but this is the 1 sample point on west, and this is the top 5 inches, the middle 5 inches, and the bottom 5 inches. So this area represents 1 sample point where I got off the four-wheeler, stuck the probe in 4 different locations and separated the top 5, middle 5, and bottom 5. And so as you can see, there are 5 west and 5 east, total of 10 different sample points. And you can see how these numbers are moving around a little bit for pH. pH can be pretty critical, you know, as it changes the, not only the acidity, but it has a significant influence on nutrients. So, Kathy, what do we call it in the lab?
Gatekeeper.
It's the gatekeeper of a lot of nutrients. You get that pH too low or too high, the gate closes. So it's important to have that pH at the right place so that the nutrients are freely available for uptake. So if you were to look at a 10-acre field, you know, we would and you would have mixed all that together and sent it to the lab, we would have got a 6.59. So when you look at the different sample points, we're ranging anywhere from 5.9 to 7.2. Not a huge swing, but it's a swing. Soil P, I mean, that's a pretty big swing. You know, if we were to mix it all together, our average number would be 46, which is not a bad place to be. You know, from a scientific perspective, you know, it's hard for me to argue, you know, the university threshold of, you know, 40, 50, 60 parts per million. You know, I support that. However, where I struggle with is that data is not an exact. It's not a 10 by 10 square. There's a lot of variability in pulling that sample, and this just demonstrates what kind of variability we see. Anywhere from 7 parts per million to 90 parts per million within this 10-acre field. If we were to separate the west and the east, we would have got 36 and 56. So the overall average is 46. So then the big question is, are we fertilizing for our strongest areas, our best areas in the field, or our weakest areas in the field? Or are we just fertilizing according to an average number? What we're doing is we're fertilizing according to an average number. And that's where some of the grid practices will take out some of that variability, and it allows you to try to bring that field into a better average number. So granted, you know, you do have phosphorus. Of course, all your phosphorus is much higher in the top 5 inches because you know, phosphorus really doesn't move in that soil. I mean, you'll get some soluble phosphorus, but you know, 98% of that phosphorus is going to stay right in that soil colloid. But pretty interesting numbers there. K, it bounces around a little bit. You do start to see some higher level Ks, you know, at a deeper portion of the soil profile. Even though K is a cation, it's not supposed to move. It does on sandy soils. This is a pretty sandy soil. It's anywhere from 1.5% to 2% organic matter. So again, our average number is 49. It's a little low, frankly. You know, I'd like to see that closer to 100 parts per million. But even when you have an average number of 49, we're anywhere from 24 to 108. You know, I see deficiencies in a lot of plants when you get into that 20 parts per million range. And potassium's a little bit different than nitrogen and some other nutrients, where it's not necessarily hitting a switch and turning those lights off. It just gradually kind of starts to affect that plant health, and you'll see it in the yield. Typically when you see it in the field with yellowing and with firing around the leaves, you're at a pretty low level where it's significantly affecting that yield. So I've mentioned phosphorus earlier. I've seen deficiencies in plants under normal conditions, meaning that soil temperature is up above 60, but I've seen at about 20, anywhere sometimes 30 parts per million is where you start to see problems in the field. Calcium, there's a very linear relationship with soil pH and calcium. Again, your average here is 556. There's some variability there, but not as much as some of the other nutrients. As low as 281, as high as 1,000 parts per million is a variability that you see from those different sample points. So manganese, a major issue on sandy loam soils. It can be a problem. 24 is the consolidated number. And for the east and west, it's 17 and 31. And overall, it's 10 to 62 parts per million. So, typically for manganese, we want to see that closer to 20 parts per million. You get down in the 15 parts per million and less, it starts to be a problem, especially if that pH, is up above 6. So it can be an issue. I just want to make note out of manganese, it's 2 east. When we go to the next one, zinc, a totally different sample point. 1 east is where your huge variability is. So these are not the same cores. You have nice levels here where you have weak levels here, and then you have a different sample point where you have nice high levels and a different sample point where you have your lowest levels. So again, there's a lot of variability even when it comes to the micronutrients. Zinc, Malic 3 zinc, you really want to be in that 3, 4, maybe 5 parts per million, I think is a sweet spot for zinc. We're anywhere from 0.3 to 14 parts per million. So again, it just should solidify, it does in my mind, that we're dealing with a lot of average numbers. And it's something you need to account for. We don't live in a perfect environment where we're making concrete decisions off of concrete data. We're making the best decisions off of average numbers. And it's still better than not looking at data, but it's just not as concrete as some of us wish it could be. So really saw the variability, probably saw more variability in the sample points than we did the depth, but we saw some variability, from pH, they're all listed there. Typically what we see in sandy soils is your classic mobile nutrients, nitrogen, sulfur, and boron will leach, and you'll typically see higher levels, depending on the time of the year, at a deeper sampling point, where some of your other nutrients that are strongly held to the soil, like calcium, magnesium, phosphorus, acidity, they typically don't move a whole lot without disturbing that soil and mixing that soil up. All right, so I'd like to real briefly kind of get into maybe the difference between a plant and soil report, and I can't do that without really setting the ground rules. And the ground rules, as an agronomist, we all know, is the Liebig's theory, the law of the minimum. So the plant growth is limited by a single nutrient versus the sum of all nutrients. And I think the staves here on the barrel shows you exactly what that means. I mean, you can have one nutrient that is short and all the other ones are excessive or adequate, and that plant's going to stop growing or it's going to be limited by that single nutrient. So that's the difficulty is our job as an agronomist, are making sure all these essential nutrients are available for uptake. And it's not always necessarily getting them there. I mean, you'll see as we talk about potassium, in dry weather, you'll often see potassium pretty quick as a deficiency, not because it's not out there, but potassium gets to that plant primarily by diffusion. So if you have dry soil and you don't have water basically, setting that environment for potassium diffusion, then you're not getting potassium to that plant. All right, so I think maybe one of the analogies between plant and soil is really looking at maybe a nutritional label when you buy food. I think that analogy would apply more to a soil analysis, where we're looking at what's in that soil, which should be available for plant uptake. A food analysis, we're seeing, what kind of sugar and carbohydrates and different nutrients are on that label. And we know that we can put that into our body, but what we don't know is, how much of that is going to be metabolized. And that's what we, try to figure out with soil Malic 3 data, but we don't always necessarily see that until we do a plant tissue analysis or a blood analysis. So I guess my analogy is a nutritional label to a blood analysis versus a soil analysis in a plant tissue. So a plant tissue data does not extract, like Malic 3 does, what's available. It digests everything that's in that plant. And if we know the plant and the stage, we know where that's supposed to be, and that's where we can apply the different crops and the stages and the data, and we have a pretty good idea if we are short or if we're adequate or if we're excessive in that plant. There's a lot of things that, again, some of the variability, in soil is, pH. pH is probably a big one where we may be extracting enough of a certain nutrient, but because that pH is too low or too high, it's not going to be available. Some of the micronutrients are probably good examples. You'll see manganese down here, pH sensitive, 120 parts per million. You don't really need to worry about that. You're going to have plenty of manganese. But if you're 10 or 15, it depends on that pH. If you're at 15 parts per million and you have a pH of 5.5, you're going to have some available for plant uptake. But if you're at 6.5, you probably aren't going to have it available because it's locked up. That gate has not opened it up to be plant available. Some things about the soil, maybe some misconceptions, or real briefly. So soluble salts is a very broad evaluation of that soil. Salts come from a number of different elements. We see it from high levels of nitrate or ammonium, depending on what was applied or what got into that soil. We see it with high levels of potassium and sodium. Just by doing a soluble salts test on the soil, unless you know what's occurred on that ground, doesn't always tell you exactly what's causing the salt problem. A good example would be if you're irrigating from a brackish water environment, you may have high soluble salts, but the next question that I'm going to ask is, well, where are the salts coming from? And if it's brackish water, you're going to see it. It's very obvious in the sodium. If you have over-applied, ammonium nitrate or ammonium sulfate or something like that, you're going to see super high ammonium levels that are creating high electroconductivity or high soluble salts. Maybe there's some confusion out there about cation exchange capacity. Often I hear people say that the CEC will never change. Well, there's something you need to understand about every lab in America. They actually don't measure the CEC, the cation exchange. What they do is calculate the CEC, and that's why you'll see on our reports we actually have CEC, sum of the cations, because that's what it is. It's really sum of the cations. But everybody understands what CEC is. Not too many people understand what sum of the cations. So that's why we typically will keep it on there. So when you apply cations, when you apply potash, when you apply limestone, that CEC, sum of the cations, will change. It will increase. So probably the only true constant that you should see from year to year is going to be the percent organic matter. When you see that CEC move up, as an agronomist, you need to be asking, well, what'd you do? What did you apply last year? Did you apply manure? Okay, well, that really won't affect a whole lot of the CEC. Did you apply calcium, gypsum? Did you apply, limestone? And if you did, you should see those different elements increase, and as they increase, your CEC will increase. So, challenge, again, real light soils, you can tell by the organic matter. This is organic matter of 4.1, so this is not our typical soil. CEC typically is going to be a lot higher on a 4.1 organic matter. So our CECs are 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 maybe, with a nice fertile ground, with our organic matter being anywhere from 1.5 to 2.5. So I guess something important to talk about with plant is the plant is really a snapshot of the past week or so, depending on how aggressive that plant is growing. A corn plant just grows so aggressively, you can, in 3 or 4 days, your plant tissue data could change. But it's an evaluation of, and not to mention the size, the smaller that plant is, the less it can buffer the change of nutrients. But there's some critical times to be for grain production. The critical times typically are earlier stages when that yield's developed, and then when you're filling that yield out. So for corn, 6 to 9 leaf stage is when you set the yield and you fill it out at tassel. For wheat, At boot stage, typically, you've developed that head, and then at flower stage, you're filling out that head. So these are the critical times that most people are doing tissue analysis. And it's also important when you do it early enough, you can fix it before a lot of those factors have been set. All right, I just want to briefly talk about some of the things I've learned from potassium data in the Midwest. Any questions about this before we move on? Oh, let me see. What's time check, Chris? All right, so I got about 10 minutes here, 5 or 10 minutes. I'll rip through this here pretty quickly. But Bob Miller is a professor at the at Colorado State. He shared this with me, and it's again, it's pretty revealing information. It's not our soil, but it's one of the first research studies out there where they're connecting the soil test potassium with this plant tissue potassium and the base saturation and the yields. And it really all started with the Midwest. They were evaluating some of the soil test K levels, and this particular field was getting potassium every year, and they were taking nice yields off of it, and they saw over a number of years that the potassium levels continued to drop. So they tried to really evaluate this a little bit better. Here's an example where they're looking at plant tissue data in Indiana, and this is very similar to what we deal with on Delmarva, at least what I see by looking at a lot of plant tissue data. The number one limiting factor for the samples going through this particular lab was 37% was percent K, and the next one was nitrogen. So again, in my opinion, and I see it on the shore, probably one of the greatest challenges, maybe beyond nitrogen management on corn, but overall the greatest nutrient challenge for grain production is potassium. Potassium often limits that potential yield growth.
Is it irrigated or non-irrigated?
This is all non-irrigated. I see it, it's a lot more significant with irrigated from my perspective because, the difference is 350 bushels versus, 160. So there's a big gap between dryland corn and irrigated corn in the mid-Atlantic Delmarva area versus, in some of these areas, it's fairly consistent from year to year. Let me see. I can spend a lot of time on here. I did actually. I was talking to Lindsay. I know she's been in touch with some of the folks in our, and Dr. Schober about, looking at some of the plant tissue data and looking at some of these issues because just because of the effect on some of the higher yields that we're growing. And I don't know Chris, what is it? 30%, 40% of Delaware farmers are under irrigation. I mean, that's a huge number. And, these guys, as they're not happy with 200 bushels, and they shouldn't be happy with 200 bushels. So they're growing a massive crop, and, this is very similar to the dry matter accumulation or the nitrogen accumulation. And when you look at potassium, there's a huge amount of potassium going into that plant. And in general, potassium has been fairly easy to manage. My perspective is you get it out there, and the plant's going to get it. It doesn't need to mineralize like nitrogen or sulfur or phosphorus. It just, when those cells break down, they become plant available. But there are more factors than that, to be honest with you. But maybe this will give you a good example. If you look at 320 pounds per acre of K, and this is what it says K. I'm not sure if it's a typo. It could be K2O. But regardless, you're looking at 162 soil test K parts per million just to grow that plant. I mean, you may only be removing, 30 parts per million, and I'm back calculating it to what you would expect to see in the soil. But in theory, when you remove this crop, it should only reduce your soil test K level by about 30 parts per million. But it took 116 parts per million to grow that plant. Are you seeing all that every time you pull a soil sample? Not necessarily. I mean, you do have a cycle of potassium. You have a lot of potassium in that plant residue, and it's slowly getting down into that root zone. But again, my point is it's significant. It's more significant than even nitrogen when you look at the gross value of potassium. The hardest part about potassium is really just keeping it in that root zone and managing or nitrogen, I'm sorry. The hardest part of nitrogen is really keeping that nitrogen in the root zone and managing the mineralization of that nitrogen. All right, I mentioned earlier diffusion is the primary means of getting potassium to that plant. So again, it's, as an agronomist, we need to recognize how all these nutrients are getting there because we need to manage them differently. Root interception is classic for phosphorus. That's why it's so important if you're going to be applying phosphorus, you get it as close to that seed or as close to those roots as possible. 2x2 is where you put your phosphorus. You broadcast all your phosphorus out there, it's going to take some time to get to that root system. You broadcast all your potassium out there, it'll get there fairly quick because it moves with water, a little bit of mass flow, but primarily be the diffusion. Why do you apply nitrogen, either broadcast or side dress in between the rows? Because nitrogen gets to that plant by mass flow. It moves with that water. So it's important, again, as an agronomist, to really ask yourself, well, is this nutrient getting to the plant by root interception, diffusion, or mass flow? Because that, in fact, will help make decisions on how to apply it and where to put it. All right, so I think I better wrap some things up here. Let me just go right to some of the data here. So one of the things they did in the study was they went to areas and they applied potassium where they saw a trend of low yields and high yields. And as an agronomist, if we look at soil test potassium level, if we saw 300 parts per million, in general, we'd say, yeah, you don't need any potassium out there. There's plenty of potassium. But in some of the Midwest soils where it's a much heavier soil and it's got a huge, some of the cations / CEC, in this particular case, they applied potassium and got a 13 bushel yield increase. Where in other areas where they had 150 parts per million of soil test K, they applied potassium and they didn't get a yield increase. So what's the deal with that? Well, the deal is potassium as a cation is being held differently in that soil, and it's competing with the charges of your calcium, of your hydrogens from your pH, and your magnesium. Magnesium is a big issue in the Midwest area. They often will look at that calcium to magnesium ratio, and this is your low plant tissue K cluster, and this is your high cluster. To make a long story short, the difference is that you had a much better yield response when you had the calcium and the magnesium balanced. The problem with a lot of the Midwest soils is they have super high magnesium levels. We don't have high magnesium levels. We have low magnesium levels. So typically what we'll see is magnesium getting locked up because of excessive calcium or sometimes excessive potassium. But it just goes to show how important it is to evaluate your balance of cations and to start looking at some of the ratios in that plant tissue. And that's what we do, is trying to find that sweet spot for your potassium, the magnesium, or some of your other ratios in the plant tissue. All right, so any questions? All right, so let me, this is an evaluation of this is an evaluation of the base saturation. And if you want to just look at maybe your CEC or some of the cations, this is typically what we see on Delmarva, a little bit lighter in that 8 to 10 is a very nice place. This is much heavier soil with 23. We had a base saturation of 1 here, and we had a base saturation of 6. So the base saturation of potassium far out yielded the lower base saturation. Why? Because the CEC and the charges of that soil just did not prevent that potassium from getting into the root hair system that was needed for uptake. So I guess in conclusion, really, at least the conclusion of this study, and it's something that I know a lot of us have been scratching our head about and talking about over the years, but this is one of the first research projects that looked at the base saturation, the soil base saturation of potassium, and basically said that sweet spot for a lighter soil is about 5. units versus, the 1 or 2% base saturation. So that's assuming everything is equal. Let's say we have 100 parts per million of soil test K on both these soils. So the next question is, well, that's a good number, but where are we with the base saturation? And this is actually a chart where you look at the CEC, and for a much lighter soil, the benefit is to be in that 3 to 5% base saturation of soil test K versus, if you have a real heavy soil here, you are going to have problems in that 1.5. Basically, it's telling you still need to be up in that 3 to 5% base saturation. So I thought that was interesting data. As an agronomist, there's not a whole lot of information out there about where the base saturation should be, but call it luck, call it whatever you want. I've been preaching about 5% on potassium. For magnesium, we like to see that at 15 to 18% base saturation. For calcium, we like to see it at that 60 to 75% base saturation, and for your hydrogen, which comes from the acidity, typically about 5. And that seems to be a good place for a lot of the high yielding soil that's coming into the lab, and also it makes sense scientifically to some of the information we've learned over the years. All right, any questions, comments? Maybe Bob Miller, who's got a lot more information about this, can join us. I know Amy's here. We heard a presentation from North Carolina, and that was about evaluating soil test potassium and applying potassium. I'm not sure if we had a whole lot of information on the base saturation, but that would be a good question to ask those folks. Pardon me?
I could ask David who
Yeah.
has that information.
Yeah, I'll talk to David more about it too, but. Any questions, comments? All right, thank you.
Yeah, like Chris said, I'm going to go ahead and talk a little bit about nitrogen management, especially in a season as tricky as we had this year. I'm not going to pretend that I have the right answer, but hopefully I can walk you through a series of steps that my colleagues and I came up with for how to kind of make sense of when and how much additional nitrogen might you need in a situation where you're trying to manage nitrogen under extreme weather. So we all know that nitrogen management is really tough, right? It's very complex. The cycle is leaky, particularly because we have these atmospheric losses of nitrogen that can occur, which we don't have with a lot of our other nutrients, like phosphorus or potassium. It's really dependent on the weather. So a lot of these processes are mediated by moisture, temperature, rainfall, et cetera. And that even though we understand the nitrogen cycle pretty well, we recognize that it's really difficult to manage nitrogen even when your conditions are ideal. We know that the forms of nitrogen in the soil can be very dynamic. And again, like I said, the rates are affected by the temperature, the moisture, the pH of the soil, et cetera. So when we start talking about application of different kinds of nitrogen to the soil, we have to consider a lot of different things. For example, if you apply manures, primarily the form of nitrogen in manures or compost is going to be organic in nature. And we know that organic N is not plant available. We have to wait for soil microbes to actually break down the carbon in that organic matter and then release that nitrogen in a form that's plant available. And that releases it into the ammonium form, which doesn't really stick around very often in our soils for a very long period of time. For example, with that positive charge on the ammonium, we're expecting that it could be held by the negatively charged soil particles like organic matter and clay, but that would be more prevalent in higher CEC soils. And Bill just talked about how we don't really have very high CEC soils. So if you don't get that nitrogen in the ammonium form in contact with the soil, then it's going to be really quickly changed into nitrate. And we know that we have a lot of different issues related to nitrate. Ammonium and nitrate are both plant available forms, but the way that plants take them up is very different. One is more active and one is more passive. And it's going to be depending on how those roots can interact with those nutrients in the soil. We all know too that proper management of nitrogen is really one of the keys to improving our nitrogen use efficiencies and preventing nitrogen losses. So when we have ammonium and or nitrate in our soils, we know we have a variety of different loss pathways that can occur. So when we're applying materials that contain a lot of ammonium, so fertilizers, for example, that are like ammonium sulfate, or that's probably the most common one, or urea, which is quickly converted into ammonium, you have to consider the possibility for volatilization. So volatilization occurs when soil pHs are higher, when it's a little bit drier, and when you're in a windier condition. And so we know that we need to get those fertilizers in contact with the soil to prevent that volatilization. So if you're applying, you want to get it knifed in the soil or get it into contact with the soil to prevent that ammonia volatilization. Once we've converted ammonium to nitrate, we have the problem pertaining to leaching. So anytime you have a lot of rainfall, excessive rainfall, or excessive irrigation that pushes that nitrate below the root zone, that's when we have the potential for nitrogen losses to the groundwater and nitrate. And another potential loss pathway we have with nitrate is that denitrification pathway. So it's the conversion of nitrate into nitrogen gas. And actually converting it to N2 gas, which is 80% of the environment, would be the best case scenario. But sometimes we have the partial denitrification where we lose a lot of NOx gases, which are considered to be greenhouse gases, to the environment if you don't get full denitrification to that N2. So we know that application method, application timing, choosing sources, those 4 R's can really help us to improve nitrogen use efficiency. But even when we do that, we know that nitrogen use efficiencies are topping out in a country like the United States, which is developed, somewhere around 65%. So there's still another 35% or more of that nitrogen that is susceptible to losses. And it's really a difficult process for us to decide how much to put on and make all these other decisions about when, where, and how to put it on. So even in the best of years, nitrogen management can be considered as a process. As the university, we give you recommendations for nitrogen rate applications. So for example, for corn, we base it on yield. And we say that 1 pound of nitrogen per bushel of expected yield is how much nitrogen you need to grow corn. But this is really a crude approximation, and that crude approximation is based on scientific data, but we know there's a lot of variability that goes on out there. And so it's not always the right answer. But it gets us in the ballpark, right? So once we have that, then we provide you with a series of ways to make adjustments to that 1 pound per bushel estimate of nitrogen need. And so some of those things are kind of rough estimates, like how much nitrogen are you going to get from a previous legume crop? Or how much nitrogen are you going to get from mineralization of soil organic N? And those numbers are not very exact either because of a lot of variability that can happen in the field. So for example, when we talk about corn following soybean, we typically recommend taking a legume credit of about half a pound of N per bushel of soybean yield that you had. And we know that there's a lot of variability with that number, and we're probably undershooting that, but we know that you need to be able to make sure you have enough nitrogen there to meet your crop need. So we'd rather be slightly underestimating than overestimating, but it does range quite a bit. Similarly with manure and soil mineralization, for manures we give a number of 60% N mineralization in the first year. But what about that N in the second year, that organic N that didn't mineralize in the first year? What about in the third year? Does 60% really mineralize, or is it more or less? And that's going to depend on all of that nitrogen cycling that we talked about earlier. So these are kind of our rough estimates. And then we have a bunch of tools that we can use to try to refine that even further. And so that's when we start talking about PSNTs, or pre-sod dress nitrate tests for corn. So can we go out there right before that period of rapid growth and make an estimate of how much of that manure N we think is still available to your crop, so that we can guide you on how much additional nitrogen to apply? We can go out there with use chlorophyll meters and take readings off our plant tissue and make guidance recommendations based on that. And then we also see a lot of models coming out like AdaptN and Encirca, which are using day-to-day weather and soil information to try to guide changes in nitrogen management over the season. And then once we have those adjustments, we start talking about the source, the method, the 4 R's. And then finally, we use our experience. So the farmers growing the corn on their fields, they do this every year, well, you know, in every rotation, and they have some understanding of how well their fields respond to nitrogen or how much mineralization they think they can get just based on the tracking the yields over time and knowing what worked and what didn't work in their fields in the past. So bringing that experience back in and making further adjustments is how we refine our nitrogen management to get better at doing it over time. Of course, there's a lot of different tools that we can use that guide that experience too. And we'll talk about the potential to use some of those this year, like the corn stalk nitrate test, including check strips when you plant your fields, and then keeping good records. So when we talk about nitrogen use efficiency, if we're applying fertilizer, that's pretty easy if you're applying inorganic fertilizer. You pretty much know how much N you've put out there. But let's say you're using manure. Then you have to start thinking about all the different estimations you have to make with regard to that manure N. We might have a manure analysis that gives us a total nitrogen and an ammonium content, but then we have to estimate, you know, based on the weather, how much mineralization can we expect in this year? What happens if we use different timing or our methods of application? And all of these things are going to impact ultimately how much of that N in the manure is available to the plant. And so we start thinking the same things about that legume N and that soil N that's associated with the organic matter. And we know that predicting those sources of N in any given year is really a pretty complex process. And that process gets even trickier with extreme weather. And so this year was kind of the prime example for that, right? In 2018 it rained, then it didn't rain, and then it rained again, and it's still raining, right? We're about to get a couple more days of rain courtesy of Hurricane Florence. And these are some pictures, and I apologize, it's a little difficult to see because of the lighting, that were taken mostly in Maryland, but like Jimmy Lewis sent us some pictures of drown out corn. And essentially we saw a lot of puddles out there, and you know, those puddles are good for ducks, but not really good for corn, right? We could characterize this season for corn as having 2 distinct wet periods. And so what I'm showing you here on this graph, you've got cumulative rainfall in inches, and you've got time of or date on the season, and then you have the 3 locations. Green on the bottom is Newark, the middle is Dover, and the top one is Georgetown. And we're looking at cumulative rainfall over those periods. And what we can see is that early in vegetative growth, we had a lot of rain, right? Here's our cumulative rainfall. And that's where we started getting those pictures of that drown out corn, because there were a lot of puddles out there. So much so that we weren't able to even infiltrate that water into the soil in a lot of cases. The other problem is if you even were able to get your corn in the first place, right? So a lot of people, planting was delayed. They might have put manure out late February, and then they didn't get to plant until June. So lots of different considerations that needed to be made. We also saw this wet period again in the late reproductive stages of corn. So when inundation or excessive rainfall occur at different parts of the season, it can have different implications for nitrogen management. I'm going to try to talk about those a little bit. Another thing we noted is that in some cases, the dry period happened right around pollination for some of that corn, which makes for a very interesting yield year too. So we had a lot of things going against us this year. We're going to focus on nitrogen and what we think happened to the nitrogen as a result of this excessive rainfall. And so one of the things we can estimate is how much rain did we get, how much water does that equate to, and about 1 inch of rain is about 27,000 gallons of water that would be applied per acre. And depending on our soil type, you can get penetration of that water anywhere from 6 to 15 inches into the soil. And so what this schematic is just showing you is the difference between a sand, a silt, and a clay, where you have in the sand very large pore spaces or macropores versus the clay where you have very small pore spaces or micropores. And obviously we know with sandy soils we have larger macropores that drain water very quickly. They also allow for rapid infiltration. And somewhere in between there is our silt, and then our clay tends to take a longer period of time to infiltrate, and you see a lot more ponding, and the water probably doesn't move as deeply as quickly. But ultimately, we know we're kind of leaning on the sand side here where we have fast infiltration rates, which means we're going to flush that any nitrate in the soil below the root zone once you get to about 15 inches deep. So if we're looking at our soil textural triangle here, here's your percent clay, your percent silt, your percent sand, and these are the different USDA characters or classifications for soil texture. Here's your sand, your sandy loam and loamy sands. Silt loam is here and loam is here. We fall somewhere around here. And so we know those green colors and those blue colors are the more rapid infiltration rates. So naturally we have a lot of really rapid infiltration. Okay. The other thing we know is that water use and even nitrogen uptake are going to depend on the stage of crop growth that you have. And so what this slide is showing is you've got inches of water on the y-axis and you've got days after planting. And your green data here is plant transpiration and your blue data is evapotranspiration. So, so essentially when the corn plant is first planted and is very small, you have a very small root system, small canopy. Most of the water that falls on that soil is going to evaporate. Very little of it is going to move through the soil, through the plants. But as you hit around V6, where you start to see this period of rapid growth, you see this plant transpiration increases and evaporation decreases. The higher proportion of that water is moving through the plant canopy at that time. So water uptake when the plants are very small is going to be very minimal, whereas when they get bigger later in the season, you can move quite a bit of water through the system, through the plant canopy. And what we know is that we can estimate effective rooting depths. So here this figure shows percent of the rooting by depth and days after emergence. And you can see here, this is the root system of the fully developed corn. So early on, but before V4, you're going to be pretty much in that top area of the soil profile. And our effective rooting is going to be expected to be 18 inches or less early in the season. So again, if we start pushing 1 inch of water 6 to 15 inches into the soil, and your effective rooting depth is only 18 inches, it doesn't take long before we push that nitrate out of the root system, out of the reach of the root system. Once we get to about tassel, you've got your full root development, you're looking at more about 4 feet, but even once you hit that 4 to 5 foot rooting depth, most of the water and nutrients that are taken up by those roots are going to occur in the top part of the soil. So this is here the percent of water extraction. So this is looking at the distribution of where is the water being taken up from in the soil by the plant. So fully developed roots are taking about 40% of their water up from the top 25% of the profile there. So you're still getting most of your nitrogen and most of your water from the surface soil. So again, if we've had a lot of rainfall and we've had a lot of nitrogen application prior to the full development of those corn roots, you're going to expect to see a lot of that nitrate moving down below the root zone to a point where it's going to be likely inaccessible to the plant. So that's if we have just a leaching issue, but we also had to deal with this ponding issue. And ponding was significant on a lot of different soils, and even though we talked about infiltration rates being very rapid in sandier soils or coarser textured soils, we also have the luck of having a very shallow water table in a lot of places. So even if you could push a lot of water through that soil quickly, it had nowhere to go. And so that's how you ended up with a lot of these ponding situations. And ponding can result in denitrification as early as 48 hours after saturation. So when you have nitrate in the soil and you've got 2 days of flooding, you start to lose it to the atmosphere through that denitrification process. Now, typically, you see this more in denser or heavier soils, and that's because they tend to be more waterlogged. But again, we have that kind of double whammy where we have the shallow water table that ends up ponding things. Denitrification usually occurs in the top 8 inches of the soil. So if you're relying on that water uptake eventually and the nitrogen uptake in the surface soils, and you've denitrified a lot of that nitrogen, there's not any there for the plant to take up. So this season, I would say, was probably one of the best for demonstrating the value of split applications of N. And I think, in my discussions with a lot of farmers, this is pretty much the norm for us, which in other parts of the country, it's still not the norm. They still apply almost all of their nitrogen pre-plant and add more at plant. But what we have is, because of the changes with manure application, we've seen a rapid increase in the amount of people who are split applying their N. And essentially, like we showed with that water uptake, similar thing happens with nitrogen uptake. So here's percent of total nitrogen taken up by the plant over the season, and here's our growth stage, or this is growing degree units. And right about V6 here, you start to see that nitrogen uptake go up really quickly. So before 35 days, or V6 roughly, you're going to have very minimal nitrogen uptake. There's your rapid uptake here. Most of your nitrogen is going to be taken up after V6. So if we've applied nitrogen early, we probably lost it this year. And that even includes manure N. But another thing that we had to consider with manure N here is that it's possible that those wet conditions actually slowed mineralization of our N. And so it could still be there, but it's not there when we get to that period of rapid uptake. It's still locked up in an organic N form. So all these things we had to consider this year. So what was the fate of nitrogen in 2018? Well, we're gonna guess that the volatilization losses were actually a lot lower than normal because it was wet. It wasn't dry, it wasn't warm, it was wet and kind of cool early in the season. But denitrification, certainly this was probably an epic year for that. And leaching, we had quite a bit of leaching too. How much leached? How much was denitrified? I can't tell you that. It's going to depend on what kind of N you put down, when you put it down, how much you put out, when you got things planted, et cetera, et cetera. So again, when people start calling us and saying, how much more N do I need to put out to make it through this season? We can't give you that answer, but we hope that we can provide a series of guidelines for considerations to make to determine how much and when you should apply more N. But ultimately, we also were asked this question, like, what is allowed under Delaware law? And both Aaron and Bob kind of covered this earlier, that if you have an increase or change in your nutrient management plan of less than 25% over the season or over that plan life, then you don't need to make an amendment. But if your nitrogen that you're going to apply is in excess of 25% of what you had recommended in that plan, that's when you need to be writing that amendment to the plan for your growers so that they have that record keeping. So a lot of different factors to consider when we started talking about when and how much more N should we put out. And the first thing we told people to do was to go out and check for crop stress. And this was especially in those ponded conditions, because less than 5 days of inundation and you start to see a lot of problems with roots. And these are some pictures that Bob Nielsen had from Purdue University. If you may know Bob, he's King Corn. So he knows lots about corn development. And so here, and it's not showing up that great, but his website has a lot of really great pictures. This one is showing the root lodging and the plant death that's related to ponding and essentially that loss of oxygen to the root zone. And the second picture is what the roots looked like when they dug them up. And it's hard to see here, but down on the lower end, I can't even show you with my pointer, but down around here, these roots are really swollen and gray in color. They almost look like a reduced iron color, and they're really mushy. And in the description of what he said he was finding with these roots is that it smelled like rotting pork. So if you dig up your plants after a period of inundation and it smells nasty and the roots look bad, it doesn't matter how much nitrogen you apply, you're not fixing that corn. And so that was the first step we wanted growers to take, because we don't want them putting fertilizer out on corn that's not going to make it. And in some cases it was maybe just one area of the field that wasn't going to make it, but we heard about a lot of people killing their whole crop and replanting, or skipping corn altogether and going to beans. And so in those situations, you probably have to make other considerations, like if you go from corn to soybean and you've already put nitrogen out on your corn, then you're going to have to make an addendum to that plan because of that. So checking for crop stress too, another way you can look, and this would be later in the season, is for the chlorosis that shows up. So one of the things about visual symptoms of deficiencies and visual symptoms in the field for abiotic stresses is that they often look the same. In my opinion, I think the number one thing we start looking at is chlorosis, right? But in this particular case, they're seeing these orangey yellow discoloration in the lower leaves of a soil that was very soggy. And that leaf, it's hard to see on this screen, but it is very uniformly yellow in color. And these are actually chlorosis that is due to root death and not due to a nitrogen deficiency. The corn, however, had a good root system, and so those roots that died off, those lower leaves would fall off, and that plant would recover because you still have a lot of green in the rest of the canopy there. Now we compare that to a flooding-related nitrogen deficiency, and you can see this whole leaf surface is kind of uniform in color, yellowish orange. Here you have a nitrogen deficiency showing up. It's this V-shaped interveinal chlorosis starting at the tip of the leaf and moving up toward the plant. And that's really where you can say these might be due to flooding, these might be due to nitrogen deficiency. So taking a look at those deficiencies and visual symptoms first. Okay, so let's say your corn did look okay and it was going to make it through the season. Then we recommended looking for evidence that the nitrogen that you had already applied was actually gone. And so if you applied manure or you were following a legume crop, you could do your PSNT for the year. Now, the issue with the PSNT was they were kind of a nightmare, and Bill can attest to this, to make recommendations on, because they were all over the place. For similar management, so same amount of poultry litter, roughly the same amount of starter N, we were seeing variations of up to from 8 to 45 parts per million. Now some of these may have been different, like some of the fields might have been flooded, other fields might have just been wet, but they weren't having that ponding. So a lot of different things going on. What we ended up doing was giving a range of nitrogen recommendation when we got a PSNT. So if you did your PSNT through the University of Delaware, instead of saying this is how much sidedress N we recommend, we kind of gave you a little bit more wiggle room this year. The other thing we suggested was that you could look at ammonium N concentrations. So the PSNTs, the way they were developed, they were based on the nitrate concentrations in the soil right around sidedress time. But if you see a lot of ammonium N in there, we were suggesting that you were having some delayed mineralization. And so you were just starting to see that organic N convert into ammonium N. And if you had a significantly higher than normal, what we normally see ammonium concentration, we kind of took that into account too when we gave that nitrogen range. It was all over the place though. So even that isn't kind of, everything is kind of turned upside down when you have a weather year like you had this year. Another question we asked is if your soil is still saturated. So this is kind of an obvious one. You can see the ponding still in the field between the corn rows there. The question, or the answer to that question then is yeah, if there's standing water in the field, it's still too wet. But even if it looks like the soil is dry on the surface, you can be still really wet, just 2 or 3 inches below the soil surface. And when you have really wet soils, you're still going to drive those gaseous N losses, that denitrification process. And so we were telling people, if you're still pretty wet, we want you to hold off on applying more N. So essentially what we would recommend is going out and digging down to about 4 to 8 inches and assessing the moisture at that level and deciding if it was time to go out and put more nitrogen or if you still needed to wait for it to dry. Related to that wetness is whether or not you could actually get equipment in the field without doing more damage than you would. The damage that you could potentially do would probably be more costly than the economic benefit you would gain by adding the N and getting a higher yield. And so this is a good example of the kind of soil compaction damage that you can do if you put your equipment out in the field when it's too wet. So the questions we asked are, could you get stuck? If you get stuck, are you going to do more damage trying to get unstuck than you would have if you just hadn't gone out there in the first place? And what kind of compaction damage? Perhaps you might be able to get away on the surface without doing a lot of damage, but if that subsoil is pretty wet, you're still going to cause a lot of subsurface compaction in that soil. So in those cases where it was still too wet to get any equipment out, if you really needed nitrogen, our number one recommendation was that you could fly some on. Got a question?
So we flew a whole bunch on because we couldn't get through the field of ground equipment. We couldn't even get the pivot around if we wanted to fertigate. But going back to what you said a minute ago, if the soil is still too saturated to drive through, am I just going to lose most of everything I fly on to denitrification?
It's a good possibility.
Or I'll lose a portion of it, but it's probably better some than nothing.
That's one of the things. Yes, it's probably you lost some still, but if you were able to fly it on and it was dry enough in that surface, you probably did get some.
Okay.
But again, you probably flew on urea, right?
No.
No? Okay. So urea is really, well, both of them volatilize very rapidly. And so that was another issue, is if you couldn't get them watered in, you probably had some volatilization losses too. But again, these are the types of things that you have to weigh when you decide, is it worth the money to put the additional N out?
Well, the nice thing was a few days later, we got 3 or 4 inches of rain watered in.
Yep. So our recommendation was to fly on about 60 pounds or less just to avoid burn. But again, that's another thing you have to weigh, is what's the cost of applying that fertilizer via aerial application, and weigh that with what the potential gains in yield would be in that season if you get that N out. And again, this kind of answers the similar question, was fertigation an option? And if you were too wet to get your equipment in the field, you were probably too wet to run your pivot too, or your linear run. You were going to cause compaction issues or other get stuck, which is kind of a nightmare when you have that. But ultimately, I think those folks who did have the option to fertigate this year probably were in the best case scenario, because what we recommended is if you could get your irrigation system out, you could put on a little bit of N at that time, and then you could go back into the corn later in the season, assess it with a chlorophyll meter, and decide if an additional N application was needed later in the season. So just some of the things that we recommended considering. Another thing we're kind of recommending on the back end is going back to some of those tools that can help you refine or gain perspective on how well you did this season with nitrogen management. And so that cornstalk nitrate test is a good example, where you would go out sometime between quarter milk line and within 3 weeks of black layer, and you take that stalk sample roughly 6 inches above the ground, you collect an 8-inch stalk sample, you cut it into pieces, dry it up, and send it to the lab for analysis and nitrate. This is what it looks like, our curves with the corn stalk nitrate. So you've got relative yield here, you've got stalk nitrate concentration, and if you look at that curve, it looks like a crop response curve that you would expect for nitrogen or for any other nutrient, where there's some inflection point above which applications of additional N were unlikely to have impacted yield. And so what we know is that somewhere between 700 parts per million nitrate in the stalk and 2,000 parts per million nitrate in the stalk is what we consider to be the optimal levels of nitrate in that stalk, meaning that you had adequate nitrogen out there to achieve your yield goals. It's below that 700 where you are missing some of your yield potential, and above that 2,000, you were probably way above your nitrogen needs for your crop. Now, one of the caveats with this year is that the excessive rainfall tends to drive those stalk nitrate concentrations a little bit higher. But again, that bottom of 700, you can definitely tell if you were in a deficient state. When you get into that optimum, it might be shifted a little bit higher this year. I can't tell you how much, because we don't have enough data in a wet season to tell you how it compares to a dry season.
Instead of doing this, wouldn't it be more accurate to do a tissue test on the ear leaf right during production than to do this after the fact?
So this is a kind of a look back, which is what you can do now. That taking the ear leaf sample is a look kind of in season to assess where you're at. But again, we don't. If
you're going to try to make a decision
this isn't to make a decision this year. This is to kind of look back on how well did you do when you made those decisions. So that if you have another year like this year, you can decide if maybe the decisions that you made were right or wrong or could have been better. Again, right now we can't go back and test the ear leaf and make a decision, right?
But you could then put additional N on, that's all I'm saying.
Yeah, so that is one of the things we could have recommended in season for adjusting in season. This is again trying to kind of take a look back on how well your decision-making process went.
So what is the 100% of the relative yield corn, the yield of corn?
What do you mean by that? Like
the 100% on the top left?
That means that essentially there was no yield increase with nitrogen that was higher than that in the stalk. So essentially, if your stalk tested down here, then you're missing about 80 or 75% of your potential yield. But if your stalk tested up here, then you aren't missing any of your potential yield. So it's a relative yield. It's how much did you actually get versus how much you would get without additional nitrogen. Okay? Greg Binford actually did a lot of work with CSNT concentrations in this region. He tested about 1,000 samples. And unfortunately, these were all mostly during drier years. So again, we can't go back and say how much you would change your concentrations in a wet year, knowing that they do get a little bit elevated in a wet year. But ultimately, we can kind of look back and say, how well are we doing at managing our nitrogen in season? So this is concentration in the corn stalk. That's the 1,000 samples or so, just arranged in ascending order. And what we can show here is that roughly within this 5-year period, 23% of the samples were testing below optimum. About 50% of the samples were testing in the excessive range. So again, if you're coming up with something like 14,000 parts per million nitrogen in your stalk sample, you know you way overshot your N in that year. And so I think this is where we have a lot of ability to kind of tighten up our nitrogen our nitrogen management. If you're consistently seeing corn stalk nitrate in that excessive range, then making some changes to the management could be helpful. And again, we're just recommending this as a way to kind of look back and say, I made some decisions in season. How did my decisions stack up to what the corn crop really needed? The other thing we're going to recommend this season is that if you're going from corn into a small grain, we don't in Delaware require a fall soil nitrate test to apply nitrogen to small grains in the fall. They do in Maryland. But in this particular year, we're going to recommend that this FSNT could be potentially a good way to guide whether or not you have residual nitrogen left over from your corn crop and whether you can make adjustments to your fall fertility plan for your small grains. This work was pretty much done by Bob Cradaville in Maryland, where they looked at a lot of different samples and yield of wheat and barley when they applied no fall N versus 30 pounds of fall N compared to the soil nitrogen concentrations in the top 8 inches of the soil in samples that were collected after corn harvest. And so ultimately they had these threshold values. If you send it to the lab to get tested and you're planting wheat and your analysis comes back at less than 8 parts per million, then their recommendation is to apply up to 30 pounds of N per acre for your small grain crop, and about 11 parts per million for barley. They also have these quick test kits that you can use, and the numbers are a little bit different because the methodology for how the nitrate concentration is determined is just a little bit different. So one of the reasons that we're recommending this is because there's potentially, depending on how well your nitrogen management decisions went or how delayed your mineralization was, you could have significant amounts of nitrogen still available for the crop. So there's 2 scenarios where Bob saw concentrations less than 10 parts per million or greater than 10 parts per million. And he looked at 2 different scenarios for whether or not that fall N application would be profitable. And so here he's seeing that 67% of the time when the soil concentration was below 10 ppm, they saw an increase in yield versus 50% of the time when it was above. But then they started to consider things like the cost of fertilizer and the amount that you would get for your small grain at harvest. And so this is a scenario where they increased their yield by 3.1 bushels per acre for when they applied the 30 pounds of N. And that N cost about 36 cents a pound. And they were getting $7.50 a bushel for their wheat, which we know is not what we're seeing now. So in this particular case, the application was profitable when the concentrations were low 55% of the time, but only 35% of the time when the concentration was above that 10 part per million. But what's more realistic nowadays is that in this particular case, they saw almost an 8 bushel per acre yield bump, and nitrogen costs about $1.02 a pound. So you were applying that, and your wheat price was $3.45 a bushel. Again, this is something that's a little bit more realistic today. And in this case, they saw about 30% of the time that nitrogen application was profitable in the fall, and only about 10% of the time when you were above that nitrogen threshold. So again, we're not necessarily promoting this to say yes or no to nitrogen application, but it's something that you can consider because it might save you time and some money if you aren't going to expect a profitable yield bump from applying fall N. But we do know that fall N or fall tillers are really where you get your yield, so you want to get as much tiller development in the fall as you possibly can. And you'll note that I didn't talk much about soybean, kind of focused this year on corn. Soybean, we still don't make a recommendation for nitrogen applications to soybean, primarily because the fixation by the legume is usually enough in conjunction with the soil residual N to yield your crop most of the time, unless we're talking about really high yielding situations, so we're talking about 70 or 80 bushel beans. Then some of the work that we've seen in the literature and also some of the work that Philip and Corey have done over at the Warrington farm suggests that an application right around pod fill can actually increase your yields when you're in those high yielding beans. But ultimately, one of the things that people may have seen this year with regard to nitrogen management on beans is with the flooding and the soils being so wet is a delay in the nodulation of the beans. And so in a situation like that, you can dig up the root system of a couple of plants and look at how well your roots are developing nodules. And if you cut those nodules open and they're a milky white or green color inside, then you know they're not fixing nitrogen at that time. If you cut them open and they're like a fleshy pink color, then you know you've got a lot of nitrogen fixation going on there. And you can kind of look at the density of those nodules that were formed on the roots too to see if you had any impact. In that scenario, if you're seeing delayed nodulation or a really low number of end-fixing nodules, you might actually benefit from a little bit of nitrogen in that particular case. But again, kind of past that point right now. So considerations for the future. So ultimately, final thoughts is that we all know that nitrogen recommendations aren't perfect, and the whole process of making a recommendation for a farmer should be considered as a process, and that we're having to deal with these changes in weather patterns and extreme weather more often, which makes nitrogen management even more difficult. But ultimately, you're using some of the tools that we've made available and trying out different management with the 4 R's to try to fine-tune that nitrogen management and increase that nitrogen use efficiencies. And also that, farmers are probably going to need a little bit more guidance, especially in a year like this year, as they make their changes to their nitrogen management in the system. So hopefully I gave you some valuable tools or thoughts on how to proceed if we have another year like this.
You had a chart on the root depth in relationship to the nitrogen uptake. What are your thoughts on the 24-inch soil nitrate test on light soil or heavy soil? We don't do much of it here, but they do it all over the place in the Corn Belt.
I haven't really evaluated it for here, but it doesn't make sense to me either. I think most of your effective rooting is going to be above 12 inches or so.
Maybe in the heavier soils, and a little bit different for nitrogen. It's not going to leach as fast as here potentially. So they may be in the soil salting longer in those scenarios versus here. That may be a value add for them there.
I wouldn't want to have to take the 2-foot soil sample, I'll tell you that much. Anybody else have any questions? All right, thanks.